Welcome to the August issue of Reason Wizardry. Firstly, I'd like to thank everyone for their extremely helpful feedback on our first issue. But I still need more feedback so I can plan future issues and make each one as useful to you as possible. So don't hesitate to contact me by email with your thoughts. Most devices in Reason have certain controls that are only modulatable when used inside a combinator. This issue is going to focus on these types of modulations, which I call Combinator Modulations. When you look inside a Combinator programmer module, you can see a list of modulatable parameters for each Reason device in your rack. Here we're looking at a Thor. What you'll probably notice in time is that this list is much larger and much more comprehensive than the list of parameters that are controllable internally, say with Thor using the mod matrix, or by CV. I'm going to give you a quick example of a combinator modulation now, and then I'm going to go into detail by showing you specific modulations that I've found useful when programming patches and working on tracks. Here we have Thor. We have two oscillators. The second oscillator is pitched down an octave. So what if we wanted to control the octave of both oscillators using a Thor rotary? Well, using the mod matrix, there's no easy way to accomplish this. You can try adding something like rotary 1 to oscillator 1 pitch, rotary 1 to oscillator 2 pitch, but you get a smooth change of pitch, not the stepped octaves that we want like this. But we can accomplish this using a combinator modulation. So let's go back up to the combinator programmer. Okay, so we've got Thor selected. We go to rotary 1, and we can directly access the oscillator 1 octave parameter. We can't do that in the Thor mod matrix, but we can here. So we'll add that in there, and then we'll add oscillator 2 as well. Now we'll just adjust their ranges so that oscillator 1 is going to maintain its relationship of always being 1 octave higher. So now we can control the octaves in a stepwise way that we want while maintaining the relationship. Here you can see oscillator 1's octave is 4, oscillator 2's octave is 3. So this is just one example where you can use the combinator to access parameters that aren't normally modulatable. Next, I'm going to show you some other parameters like this using Thor. Now I'm going to tell you about a technique that I call Synctable. I stumbled upon this technique when I was producing the Pantheon refill. To understand it best, I'm going to recommend that you read the manual section on oscillator sync first. I'm going to go into a bit of background, but still it's best to have that basic knowledge to understand this most easily. So with oscillator sync, you have a master and a slave oscillator. In Thor, oscillator 1 is always the master, oscillator 2 and 3 are the slaves. And we're going to just talk about sync with 2 oscillators right now, just to keep it as simple as possible. So this button right here turns on sync. And once we turn on sync, you're going to notice that the tuning controls on oscillator 2 are going to have a different effect than usual. Let's listen. Okay, that's a bit different than you'd expect. Let's turn off sync and change the tuning. So with sync on, you don't get a tuning change on the second oscillator. You actually get a tonal change, and that's inherently the sound of sync. If you want to change the tuning, you have to do that up here on oscillator 1. So you could think about oscillator 1 just as your tuning section for your sound. And oscillator 2 is where you're going to sculpt the sound itself. You cannot tune it there. So by changing oscillator 2's tuning values, we can achieve a wide range of sounds. Some basic techniques for achieving these sounds are mapping an envelope to oscillator 2's tune. Let's just quickly try that. We'll get a mod envelope to pitch. I will make the envelope quick. Increase the amount. So that's a characteristic sync sound. Nothing really advanced about that. This is where the combinator modulation part comes in. I've found that by changing the keyboard value of oscillator 2 while playing back a note, you can get a morphing sound that's unlike anything else. Let's try a different sound, a different oscillator here, just for a better example. So what's this doing exactly? This is changing the amount that oscillator 2's tuning is affected by MIDI keyboard key tracking. That's what that knob does. So if we turn keyboard all the way down, essentially oscillator 2 is always playing the same note. And if we turn it all the way up, it's key tracking like normal. Of course, we know that tuning isn't going to be controlled here, so that's why we can play with this keyboard command, not change tuning, but instead get this morphing tone. Now, wouldn't it be cool to modulate that so, we don't have to manually move this knob? That would be great, but we can't using Thor's mod matrix. Say take a rotary oscillator 2, there is no keyboard destination. So enter the Combinator Modulation. We can access it using the Combinator Programmer. Oscillator 2, keyboard. So now we can take this one step further and modulate this parameter using a CV signal from Thor or elsewhere. You do that by flipping the rack around, and you can see that each rotary for the combinator has a CV input. So we could take LFO2 from Thor and route that into rotary 1, which is of course controlling the keyboard parameter. Now look, you can actually see the modulation happening. We can adjust it using our LFO2 controls. We can flip the rack back around and increase the modulation amount using this small rotary. And let's hear it. A little bit of coarse, and how about some more release? So I just have a few more notes on how to use Synctable best. It doesn't matter what waveform you choose for oscillator 1. That makes no difference at all to the end result. Just remember to think of oscillator 1 as your master tune controls. It's great to use a wavetable oscillator for oscillator 2 because in addition to the keyboard morph, you can also use the position control as well. Let's quickly map an envelope to the position amount. So it really gives you a wide palette of sounds to choose from when you use a wavetable oscillator as your second oscillator in this kind of Synctable configuration. Also, just a small note about the bandwidth slider here. You can further alter the sync sound using that. I find it's roughly equivalent to the resonance of the sync, so you'll have a stronger, more resonant sync sound with bandwidth all the way up, and a more muted sound with bandwidth all the way down. Of course, to map this control or modulate it, you'll also have to go back to the Combinator programmer because it's not modulatable in the mod matrix either. So we could map a second rotary to oscillator 2 sync bandwidth. Now I want to show you a patch from our Pantheon refill that uses Synctable. I want to show you it for two reasons. One, just as an example of an advanced implementation of Synctable, and two, as an example of Pantheon and what you can expect from this refill in terms of quality and the standards that it has. So, let's play it back. It's a Thor sequence, which will start when we push a key. Okay, so our first combinator knob here is going to give us our sync table effect. Watch the keyboard parameter and listen. So we never discussed sync table using FM pairs, but as with wavetable oscillators, FM pairs are great for sync table because you have that additional FM parameter to add liveliness to the sound. That parameter is mapped to our second rotary. We have an LP filter in our second filter slot here, and we can control its filter envelope depth using this knob. So we almost get a pad without that quick, snappy filter. This knob controls the mix of the comb filter. Listen as I turn it up. So it adds a metallic ringing after each note. And then for the buttons, the first button increases the octave of the FM pair oscillator by 1. As you already know from sync table, that's going to just change the tuning, which in turn is going to change the tone of our sync sound. We can also add a slight bit of envelope modulation to our comb filter. Kind of like some chaos in the plucked note. Of course, we have our unison effect on-off here. And our button to turn off the sequencer. In addition, every Pantheon patch even has unique mod wheel assignments. In this case, moving the mod wheel up and down raises the high shelf of the equalizer. And then the final step of every Pantheon patch is also to map the rotaries and buttons of the Thor devices uniquely. So here we have the filter cutoff and filter resonance for the state variable filter. A toggle for our delay. We also have a button that's going to add some movement to the FM oscillator. basically add an LFO to modulate this knob. And once again, you can see here, our first master oscillator is just a simple analog oscillator, and it doesn't matter whatsoever what wave shape it's got programmed for it. This could just as easily be a wavetable oscillator. It would have the exact same sound. But we can change our tuning with it. So that's a really comprehensive look at that technique. Hopefully you can use that to make some really interesting sounds of your own. Icicles is free with this pack, so you can have a look at it, take it apart, improve it, do whatever you want with it. The next combinator modulation I'm going to show you also uses Thor, and it focuses on the wavetable oscillator. The wavetable oscillator is great, and it's simple to use, and it's so capable of many different sounds by using its position knob. But what if you really like the formant wavetable for your patch, but you can't really decide between it and the voice wavetable? You can actually modulate the table itself using Combinator Modulations, and suddenly Thor and wavetables are much more powerful. Let me show you what I mean. Here, I've already mapped Rotary 1 to Oscillator 1 Wavetable Table. Now, when I move Rotary 1, I can scroll through all the possible tables. You could also use a button for it. So we could go button 1 and say we wanted the formant table and the synced sine. Keep in mind that the range starts at 0, so basic analog is 0. So we want synced sine, which is 1, and formant, which is 28. So let's add that in here. Oscillator 1 wavetable, 1 and 28. So that's great for changing up a sound in real time to something completely different. But of course, the next level is modulating that parameter. And as you've already seen with the Synctable tutorial, it's very simple to do that. So let's do it in a little bit different way though. Let's create a matrix device. And let's connect up its curve parameter. We'll disconnect that. Let's connect up its curve parameter to Rotary 1. Okay, now let's just draw in kind of a smooth curve there. Push play. We'll need to set the Rotary 1 actual physical knob back to the middle. And you can see that as we're going through our sequence here, move so you can see both at the same time, we're modulating the wavetable value. That's a pretty cool rhythmic patch just in of itself. Completely random curve here, random modulation amounts. You could fine-tune that into a really cool cutting-edge patch with no problem. Let's try randomized pattern. And let's adjust the modulation range on the back of the combinator. Now keep in mind we still have the position knob that we can modulate as well. So let's just get advanced here and take LFO2, oscillator 1 position. Okay, so that's about a minute more work, and I think that's an impressive patch. So when you use wavetables like this, modulating not only the position of the table, but the table itself, wow, there's a whole lot more possibilities. And I really encourage you to get in deep with this, modulate in different ways with different modulators, and you're going to get some great results. Did you ever want a longer pattern inside your matrix pattern sequencer? 64 steps, 128 steps even? Or maybe to even compose an entire track inside a single combinator? You can do any of that, and it's easier than you think. And you use Combinator Modulations to do it. If you've used any of our refills, you'll already know we like to use combinator rotaries to control which pattern a matrix or redrum plays. Well, now that you've already learnt a bit about combinator modulations, you'll probably realize it's simple to control one of these knobs with another modulator. What if the modulator was a second matrix? What you'll have then is a sequencer which chooses which sequence the main matrix plays back. Okay, maybe I'm a little bit ahead of myself. I'm going to show you a patch from Pantheon that uses this technique to the maximum amount. So first we've got our melodic combinator, and it's got a matrix playing 8 different patterns. Let's listen to just pattern 1, pattern 2, pattern 3, pattern 4, etc. So there's 8 different patterns there. Now, in order to sequence those patterns together and stitch them into a more complete arrangement, we use a second matrix. I'm going to show you how to do that now. The first thing we need to do is go into our combinator programmer, set up one of the rotaries to select between all the patterns. So here you can see we've already done that. Rotary 1 is mapped to pattern select 0 to 7. So that's 8 different patterns on our matrix down here. Okay, so it's also up here and you can see it says pattern in use. And when we write in use, that usually means we don't want you to change it because we're modulating that rotary from the back of the rack. So you can see we're modulating it from our Matrix 2 device. So essentially, this curve in our Matrix 2 is selecting between the different patterns in our Matrix 1. Now that could just be a little bit much to get your head around. Hopefully you can continue on with that. Basically that means if we had a value of 0 for one of these steps, then our first pattern would play back in this matrix. If we had a value of 127, then our 8th pattern would play back, and everywhere in between for patterns 2 through 7. So I'll show you the results of that, and we'll just push play with both matrices working. So we have pattern 2, now pattern 3, and back to 2. Okay, so now the next step is that we can have obviously different patterns inside, should we call this our arranger matrix? So we've got those patterns mapped to a second knob. So let's change this. Okay, so now you can see we've got a different arrangement. So this is going to cause different patterns in our melodic matrix, we could call it, to play back in a different order. So now let's push play. So we've got our first pattern playing, and then it's going to switch up to number 4, number 5, okay, we have one more arrangement, and you can see once again it's going to change up which patterns are playing in the melodic matrix and when they play. So let's hear that. Start that one more time. So hopefully that's starting to sink in, and you don't have to get that complicated with it. So instead you could just use it to chain 2 patterns together to make a 64-step pattern. That'd be, the most basic use of this type of technique. But you can continue on. We could use a 3rd rotary and a 3rd matrix to control when these master sequences happen. And that would be essentially then creating an entire arrangement inside a combinator that you could push play, and it could play for, a minute or 2, and it would sound like a complete arrangement, of one instrument anyway. So there are a couple of limitations to keep in mind. You'll notice that a lot of times I'm changing the pattern right before the bar, and that's because if you change the pattern on the bar, it's going to happen late. So you need to change your patterns one step before the bar. And in experimenting, you'll hear exactly what I mean. But you see, you notice everywhere here. So there's 4 steps. There's another 4 steps. But on the 4th step, I'm changing instead of right on the beat. Additionally, you might have to fiddle with the trigger points here to find each particular pattern that you want. Like, we know that the first pattern is going to be at 0 and the last pattern will be at 127. But we're not really sure where all the other patterns are inside there. So you're going to have to play back your sequencer here and just try different values until you get the pattern that you want to play on your melodic matrix. So it takes a little bit of time to fiddle with, but the results that you can get with complex combinators are just beyond what you've ever expected. Hopefully by now you're starting to get the hang of combinator modulations. I'm going to go through some other modulations using different reason devices a little bit quicker than the first couple we've done. So the next one is going to use Malstrom. I'll just play a few notes of this sound I've dialed up here. It's basically just a strings patch, run through some unison for some stereo width. So we'll just play a chord. So really basic, no filter, just one oscillator, really basic. So what's nice about Malstrom is that you can use this shift parameter to shift the formants. It's really great for pad sounds and whatnot. You can use LFOs here, or they call them modulators in Malstrom. You can use those or the mod wheel or velocity to affect shift, but you cannot use an envelope. This filter envelope in Malstrom is very limited. It can only be used for filters. But we can use combinator modulations to apply the filter envelope anywhere we want in Malstrom or even in another Reason device. So let's try that. We're going to open the programmer, select Malstrom, go to our first rotary, go to Oscillator, A, Shift, and we'll set the range 0 to 63. So now we've got our first rotary controlling the shift knob, as you can see. So now we're going to modulate that by, you guessed it, flipping the rack around. And we're going to use the CV output from the filter envelope to go to rotary 1. I've already set up a somewhat suitable filter shape here. It's got a little bit of attack, and then a longer decay, no sustain, and a release. So let's give that a shot. So you can see the knob moving, and that's another great thing I really haven't mentioned much about with combinator modulations, is that you can actually see the knobs or sliders moving in real time. So it's really easy to visualize what your modulations are doing. You usually don't, well, you don't get that with CV or internal modulations of all devices. So it's easy to set up your range. So we might need a little bit more modulation range here so it reaches all the way to the end of the shift knob. So we'll go back here a little bit more. Maybe a slower decay. That's a bit much. Or we could set the range so that it's going to return to an even lower value. So that's now its low value. So that's a nice mellow string sound with a bit of a twist. Okay, now here's something I haven't mentioned about combinator modulations yet, but you've probably already realized. Since we're using CV for the modulations can only be monophonic. That means that there's not a different modulation signal for each note that I play. So if I'd play 3 notes in a row, holding all of them down, watch the shift knob. Each note that I play is going to reset the shift knob. So every note isn't going to have a different shift value. It's not polyphonic. Now, if you're having trouble with this distinction, it's explained fairly well in the Thor bonus video. If you've prepaid, you already got that. If not, that's available as a back issue for a minimal cost. So they're only monophonic modulations, which is important because they're definitely more limited. If you use a monophonic sound, you won't have to worry about it. Then that's what you'd expect. But when you're playing back chords, it's almost easiest just to try it so you know what I mean. When you're playing back chords using a modulation like this, it's going to react a little bit strange. So just so you're aware of that. So I'm not going to go through all the different bits of Malstrom that you can control in a similar way using combinator modulations. You can use your own imagination. You know, you could control the shape or amount. You could control the LFO rate with an envelope. You can do a whole variety of things with combinator modulations once you know the basics. Now I'm going to take a little bit of a detour. I usually don't do this. I like to keep things focused, but there's just something else that's too good not to share with you now that we're on this topic of monophonic and polyphonic modulations. Like I said, the combinator modulation is monophonic. So if we were going to use the filter envelope to modify shift, it's going to only be a monophonic modulation. So if we wanted a polyphonic modulation, there's actually a way to do that using Malstrom, and it's not as flexible as using the filter envelope, but depending on your application, you may want to try it as well. And it's using an LFO as a substitute for an envelope. Malstrom has some really cool LFO shapes, and they can act just like an envelope. So if you look at this shape, basically it's just like a quick decay. So if we click one shot on, that means the LFO is going to only play once and then stop. So essentially that's an envelope right there. We don't need to sync it to tempo because an envelope usually isn't synced to tempo. So what we're going to do is just really quickly remove this combinator modulation I had before. We're going to add some shift modulation using this LFO. So if you only need a basic envelope shape, and what you want to modulate is in the LFO list, you can use one of these simple decay shapes in one-shot mode as a substitute. And that's not available in Thor or any of the other Reason devices. So just keep in mind how powerful these mod slots are in Malstrom. It's important to realize that combinator modulations aren't just useful for the synths. Actually, they're even more useful for effects devices. Now, I have a future issue planned that's going to talk more about effects devices, but I'm going to still show you some quick examples of what you can do with combinator modulations and effects devices here. And I say it's more important for effects devices because they generally have few CV inputs and they have no internal mod matrix or fixed mod routing like Malstrom. So oftentimes the only way to modulate their parameters is using combinator modulations. So I've got this rack set up with a Dr. Rex loop. This is what it sounds like dry. So it's running through a Scream 4 with no damage set up. I'm going to use the body parameter, and I'm going to show you that if we flip the rack around, only the scale parameter in the body section is exposed to CV. So auto and resonance cannot be accessed, or type. So let's modulate the resonance. So we're going to open the programmer, go to the Scream, go to Rotary 1, body resonance. So now you can see that's controlled by Rotary 1. So let's modulate that with, well, we already have a Dr. Rex, so let's use Dr. Rex LFO for the resonance. There we go. We'll slow down that LFO a bit here. Okay, so you can see how you can modulate Scream 4 parameters that aren't accessible via CV using combinator modulations. So I'm going to bypass that, and next we've got an EQ here, M-class EQ. And M-class EQ sounds great, and you can't usually modulate it or do anything with it for sound design. You know, it's meant for mastering. It has no CV at all. But we can use combinator modulations and use it like a monophonic filter and create some pretty impressive filter shapes and whatnot. So I'm going to program just kind of a double peak in here. Well, we'll play things back as we're programming. So something kind of like that. Now we'll open the programmer and we'll remove this Scream 4 modulation. And instead, we will select our M-class EQ. And go to parametric 1 frequency. And parametric 2 frequency. So it's reset our values here. It's let's reset our values. So I'm going to just have to program the ranges in here. You can see the EQ bands moving. I don't want them to move that much, so I'm going to just create a smaller range here, limit them a bit. Okay, now you can see kind of what they're doing. That's not quite what I want yet. Okay, getting there. There we go. That looks better. So that's like a double peak that we've just programmed using a M-class EQ. Let's listen to it. And of course, if we vary their Q values, and their gain, you can get different sounds. We can use negative gain, and you get like a notch filter sound. It's a little subtle there. That's kind of nice actually on the snare hits. Okay, so with the M-class EQ and combinator modulations, you can get a long way to creating your own filters, your own filter effects. You know, like the sky's the limit here. You can modulate the shelves at the same time. And of course, you can use multiple M-class EQs. I'm going to leave it at that with the filter and EQ stuff because I'm going to save that up for another issue. Okay, so I'm going to bypass that, and we have one more device here, the RV7000 Reverb. And it does have some CV inputs. It's got decay, high frequency damping, and a trigger for its gate. But there's a lot of different parameters that aren't modulatable, starting with something like diffusion, which creates, is it going to be a very rough sounding coarse or very smooth? So let's play back our drum loop again. And I'm going to have a very wet mix just so we can hear the effect of diffusion first. So you can hear that's kind of the rough sounding reverb, almost more of a delay. So we can modulate that as well. Select our RV7000. Now there's a lot of parameters in here and they're not organized that well either, I find. There's some down at the end that you'd expect to be kind of at the beginning. So if you don't find what you want right away, just look around. Okay, so Hall diffusion. And it's actually being modulated right now because our LFO is still hooked up to rotary 1, which is now connected to Hall diffusion. Let's try something more more esoteric sound design just before we're done here. Switch to small space. Small space is like a really fast comb filter. It produces some strange sounds. If you've used the reverb a lot, you've probably stuck to like Plate and Hall, like they're really nice, smooth sounding stuff, but you can create some interesting sound design using the small space. So let's just play that back. wall irregularity is awesome for modulating. That basically increases the length of the delay. Mod rate and mod amount are also good for modulating with combinators. We'll try wall irregularity though. So I'll head back up here, click on rotary 1. There it is, small wall irregularity. So you can see it changing. Let's change the LFO shape. So you can hear it's changing on the beat right now. It's got a little bit of a glitch there. You'd have to work with the ranges a bit to make it glitch free. Of course, you can modulate more than one of these using a second knob. So mod amount combined with wall irregularity. That doesn't sound anything like the original beat, does it? That actually sounds really smooth. I like that. I'll leave that patch for you. Okay, so that section hopefully served both as a primer on combinator modulations with effects devices and just kind of some insight into sound design using Reason's effects devices. And as you can guess, and as you've heard, there's going to be more on that soon. We've reached the end of the August 2009 Reason Wizardry issue. I really hope you enjoyed it and you learnt some new techniques for your patches and tracks with combinator modulations. There's a lot of material in there. If you have questions about it or something just didn't make sense, you're completely welcome to email me or post on our forum, and I'll do my best to help you out with it. Thanks so much for watching Reason Wizardry this month. I'm Jeremy Jansen. Cheers.